Hello, I'm Craig, and today we're going to look at frequency and wavelength. What we're going to look at is part of this PowerPoint. We're not going to do lessons 4 and 5, partly because on this particular PowerPoint they haven't been completed yet, and that would be something we would do in a classroom, or we may do it another time. But for today, we're going to look at lessons 1, which is what is frequency, lesson 2, what is wavelength, and lesson 3, units of measurement. So, by the end of the first lesson, we will cover these terms. We will define what wave cycles are. We will look at Hz, kHz, mHz, and GHz as units of measurement and explain what they are. And we will look at frequency characteristics. In other words, what you might use a certain radio frequency for, because different frequencies have different characteristics. Okay, on the right side here we have wave cycle definition. A wave cycle is an electromagnetic wave, bracket sine wave, that passes a given point per unit time. One wave cycle per second would be the unit frequency of 1 Hz. In RF communications, the lowest usable wave cycle frequency is used for submarine communication, and it's in the ELF, extremely low frequency band. Now, if we look over to the left-hand side here, you've got this, which is a sine wave, and this line, see I'm pointing here, starting there and going to there, which is coloured purple for those that are able to see. I'm saying that because some people might be colourblind watching this, so I'll just explain from this point to this point, this arrow here. Now, that is a time period. So if we imagine that time period is 1 second, we have one sine wave. So it's starting here, going up, down, and back to the start. That is one complete cycle. Now we've got one complete cycle in 1 second. So that means we have one wave cycle per second, or 1 Hertz. Okay. If we had 10 of these sine waves in this 1 second period, that would be 10 Hertz. 1,000 in that time period, 1,000 Hertz. So do you get the idea? Okay, but in this case, if we count that as a 1 second period, we've got one cycle, so it's 1 Hertz. Okay, right, let's look at the next slide now. Right, Hz, kHz, mHz, GHz. So, first of all, Hz stands for Hertz, as I've previously mentioned. So 1 Hertz would be 1 cycle per second, 10 Hertz would be 10 cycles per second. Now, kilohertz, as we can see over here, is equal to 1,000 Hertz. So 2 kilohertz would be 2,000 Hertz, 5 kilohertz, 5,000 Hertz. Now, megahertz, million Hertz. That's right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 noughts, 1 and 6 noughts. Million Hertz. Okay, so 2 megahertz, 2 million Hertz, 2 million cycles per second. Now, this here is the radio, this diagram showing the radio part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So at the lower end, we have the extremely low frequency of 3 to 30 Hertz, which, as I said earlier, was used for submarine communications. Now we go up to here, for instance, we have VHF, very high frequency, with a frequency of between 30 and 300 megahertz. So between 30 million and 300 million cycles per second. Now, go up to UHF, ultra high frequency. Now, this diagram, which I've got off PowerPoint using this image search facility is wrong. You notice here it says hertz. That should say megahertz. It should say MHz, like we've got up here. Okay. Just looking around actually. What else is just checking this? So for HF 3 to 30 megahertz, that's correct. That should be kilohertz as well. Yes, that isn't right either, is it? Because if you look here, we go hertz, kilohertz. That should say kilohertz as well. But you get the idea. As a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that will be used for radio communications, and different parts of it have are classified into different bands. We have hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, etc. Now, radio frequencies, in fact, I think this next slide will explain this. I'll try to do this without messing up. There we go. Right, frequency characteristics. As I said, different frequencies are more suitable for different things. So let's just read this. Frequency characteristics: less than 1 megahertz, extremely low frequency, used for submarine communication, as it's able to penetrate water. It's also used for long-wave broadcasts and beacons. 1 to 30 megahertz, known as the HF band, which stands for high frequency. Long distance communication via ground wave, where the radio waves follow the ground, the contours the ground, and sky wave, where it's been bounced off the ionosphere. Skywave signal propagation. The propagation is how the radio waves get from one point to another. Now, above the 30 megahertz is generally line of sight. So it's limited by the Earth's curvature and physical obstructions such as hills. So if they're going, they don't quite go in a straight line, but they're basically going in a straight line of sight. They're not going to like hills, because hills block the signal. So that's why you would use a repeater system, which is a device put on top of a hill, receive the signal from one side and rebroadcast it out to the other side. So you get the idea. Different frequencies have different characteristics. Now, another advantage of, say, UHF and VHF is the shorter antennas, making it useful and practical for, if you can hear that, there's a fighter jet going over, makes it useful and practical for portable and handheld equipment. Because the other thing I need to explain, as you can see down here, it says increasing wavelength, increasing frequency. What happens is, as the frequency increases, the wavelength decreases, and vice versa. So the wavelength is very long at low frequencies and very short the higher frequency you get. Now, if we were going to, for instance, use a quarter wave antenna, which is a popular simple type of antenna, the length of it will be quarter of the wavelength, because it's quarter wave. So obviously, as the frequency is increasing, the antenna length are getting smaller. So at UHF, they're only a few centimeters long, which is great, because if the lower frequencies, so if we look at the long wave, there'll be a very long, does it actually tell us here, long wave? Yeah, it actually tells us it's between 1 kilometer and 10 kilometers. That is the wavelength. So even if we had a quarter wave, quarter of that for our antenna, it's still a significantly long antenna. So not ideal. Okay, so I want you to sort of get that into your head, that different frequencies are used for different applications. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, and vice versa. And different frequencies have different characteristics. I mean, if we look at below 30 megahertz, so 1 to 30 megahertz, the HF band, certain frequencies within that range of frequencies are suitable for different times of the day. Some work better at night, some work better in the day, etc. It's like I say, there's lots of advantages and disadvantages in terms of range, reliability, and it's something which I can go into more if you'd like. Just leave me some comments. So that is what you want to understand. So increasing frequency, decreasing wavelength, and vice versa. And the frequencies are used for different things. As you can see on this picture, satellite communications up in what's known as the sort of microwave bands above 3000 megahertz. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So the first lesson summary. Wave cycle is the same as frequency. Frequency is measured in cycles per second in units of hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, etc. Different frequency bands are suitable for different applications. Second lesson. In this lesson, we will cover these topics. What is wavelength? The wavelength relationship to frequency and wavelength characteristics. Wavelength definition. Wavelength is the distance after which the fields of an electromagnetic wave repeat themselves. Now, if you look at the diagram on the left, you can see it marked wavelength between the two peaks of the cycle. So it's doing one complete cycle. That is the wavelength, and the horizontal axis being the time. Now remember, the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, because you're getting more cycles per second per time period. So if we had 1 cycle per second, that'd be 1 hertz. If we had 100 per second, that'd be 100 hertz, going up and up and up to the sort of millions of hertz that we typically use in radio communications. So that is what the definition of wavelength. It's the wavelength is the distance after which the fields of an electromagnetic wave repeat themselves. Wavelength relationship with frequency. Wavelength, as I think I already mentioned, gets shorter the higher the frequency, and conversely, the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. So we've got a chart here of the electromagnetic spectrum, a diagram. So we've got down here on the left 1 hertz. I keep forgetting this pointer's not showing up on the video recording. So 1 hertz on the left hand side, 1 hertz being 1 cycle, 1 electromagnetic wave cycle per second, and you'll have a very long wavelength. And as you go into the right hand side, you're going up in frequency, the wavelength is getting shorter. Now the wavelength is measured in millimeters, centimeters and meters. So 145 megahertz would be 2 meters, 440 megahertz would be 70 centimeters. So you get the idea. So and well, let's go low. So in the HF bands, 0 to 30 megahertz, let's get this right. 28 megahertz is the 10 meter. It's got a wavelength of roughly 10 meters. 27 megahertz has got a wavelength of 11 meters. So you can see the relationship. So as the frequency goes up, the wavelengths get shorter. Yeah, and thank you for watching this presentation. Hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, please get in touch. Thank you again. Bye.